Welcome to the fascinating story of Minnesota, a land of 10,000 lakes, though it actually has closer to 12,000. This is a tale that spans thousands of years, from ancient peoples navigating pristine waterways to becoming one of America's most progressive and economically diverse states. Minnesota's history is one of indigenous wisdom, European ambition, immigrant dreams, and constant reinvention. It's a story of brutal winters and bountiful harvests, of iron ore and information technology, of small towns and metropolitan innovation. Today, we'll journey through time to understand how this northern state, whose name comes from the Dakota words Minnesota, meaning cloudy water or sky tinted water, became the unique place it is today. From the ancient woodland peoples to the tech corridors of the Twin Cities, this is the complete history of Minnesota. Part 1: The First Peoples Ancient Minnesota, 10,000 BCE, 1650 CE. Long before any European set foot in what we now call Minnesota, this land was home to sophisticated indigenous societies. The story begins at the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, when Paleo-Indian peoples followed mammoths and other megafauna into the region as massive glaciers retreated northward. These early inhabitants left behind distinctive fluted spear points, evidence of their presence found at sites like Browns Valley in western Minnesota. As the climate warmed and stabilized, the archaic peoples emerged around 5000 BCE. They developed more diverse hunting and gathering strategies, creating specialized tools for harvesting the region's abundant wild rice, fishing its countless lakes, and hunting in its vast forests. The old copper complex, centered around Lake Superior, saw indigenous peoples mining and working copper as early as 3000 BCE, among the earliest metalworking in the Americas. Around 500 BCE, the woodland tradition emerged, bringing pottery, burial mounds, and more complex social structures. The most spectacular examples are the burial mounds at what's now Indian Mounds Park in St. Paul, overlooking the Mississippi River. These weren't primitive peoples. They had extensive trade networks reaching to the Gulf of Mexico and the Rocky Mountains, trading copper, furs, and pipestone from the sacred quarries of southwestern Minnesota. The Dakota and Ojibwe nations. By 1650, when French explorers first arrived, Minnesota was primarily home to the Dakota Sioux people, who had lived in the region for centuries. The Dakota were not a single tribe, but a confederation of 7 council fires: the Madewakanton, Wapakude, Wahpeton, Sisseton, Yankton, Yanktonai, and Teton. The eastern Dakota in Minnesota lived in semi-permanent villages along rivers, cultivating corn, beans, and squash, while also hunting and gathering. The Ojibwe, also called Chippewa or Anishinaabe, began migrating into Minnesota from the east in the late 1600s and early 1700s, part of a centuries-long migration from the Atlantic coast. Armed with French guns and seeking new beaver hunting grounds for the fur trade, they gradually pushed into territories traditionally held by the Dakota. This led to over a century of intermittent conflict between the two nations, with battles fought across northern and central Minnesota. The Ojibwe brought with them the Midewiwin, or Grand Medicine Society, a complex spiritual and healing tradition that remains important today. They also perfected the harvesting and processing of manumin, wild rice, which became central to their culture and economy. The Dakota and Ojibwe developed different but equally sophisticated ways of life, adapted to Minnesota's diverse landscapes. The Dakota, dominating the prairies and river valleys of the south and west, the Ojibwe, the forests and lakes of the north and east. Part 2. European Contact and the Fur Trade Era. First European Explorers. The first Europeans to glimpse Minnesota were French explorers and missionaries in the mid-1600s. Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers likely reached Minnesota around 1660, though the first well-documented European visitors were Father Louis Hennepin and Michel Acco, who were captured by Dakota warriors in 1680 and taken to their villages near Mille Lacs Lake. Hennepin later gave the first written description of the Falls of St. Anthony, the only major waterfall on the Mississippi River, located at present-day Minneapolis. Daniel Greysolon, Sieur Duluth, arrived in 1679, establishing peaceful relations with both Dakota and Ojibwe peoples, and claiming the region for France. These early French explorers weren't seeking to settle the land, but to exploit its rich fur resources, particularly beaver pelts that were in massive demand for fashionable hats in Europe. The fur trade system. The fur trade fundamentally transformed Minnesota and its indigenous peoples. French voyageurs, many of whom married indigenous women, and created the distinctive Métis culture, paddled birch bark canoes through Minnesota's interconnected waterways, establishing a network of trading posts. Grand Portage, on the shore of Lake Superior, became the great inland depot of the Northwest Company, with massive canoes carrying trade goods inland and furs back to Montreal. The fur trade created the first global economy in Minnesota. Dakota and Ojibwe trappers harvested beaver, muskrat, otter, and other furs, trading them for metal tools, guns, cloth, and other European goods. This trade brought prosperity, but also dependency, disease, and alcohol. Traditional seasonal rounds of hunting, gathering, and agriculture were disrupted as indigenous peoples focused increasingly on trapping for trade. Competition between trading companies was fierce. The British Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company fought for dominance after Britain took control of the region following the French and Indian War in 1763. American traders entered after the Revolutionary War, with the American Fur Company, owned by John Jacob Astor, eventually dominating the Minnesota trade in the early 1800s. Fort Snelling and American control. The United States gained formal control of eastern Minnesota through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 and western Minnesota after the War of 1812 to assert American sovereignty and regulate the fur trade. The U.S. Army established Fort St. Anthony, later renamed Fort Snelling, in 1820 at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, a location the Dakota called Bedot, a place of great spiritual significance. Fort Snelling became the nucleus around which American Minnesota would grow. The fort's soldiers, commanded initially by Colonel Josiah Snelling, not only maintained peace between the Dakota and Ojibwe, but also enforced American law, prevented British incursion from Canada, and inadvertently became the region's first agricultural experimenters, growing crops to supplement their supplies. The fort also became an unlikely center of the slavery controversy. Slavery was illegal in the territory, but Army officers brought enslaved people as personal servants. The most famous of these was Dred Scott, who lived at Fort Snelling from 1836 to 1838 and later sued for his freedom based on his residence in free territory, leading to the infamous 1857 Supreme Court decision that helped precipitate the Civil War. Part 3: Treaties and Dispossession. The treaty era between 1805 and 1889, the United States government signed a series of treaties with the Dakota and Ojibwe nations that systematically transferred millions of acres from indigenous to American control. Each treaty was presented as mutually beneficial, but they were often signed under duress, with terms that were misrepresented or misunderstood. The first significant treaty was Pike's Purchase of 1805, in which explorer Zebulon Pike acquired 100,000 acres at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers for $2,000, though the Dakota were only ever paid $200. The 1837 treaties with both the Dakota and Ojibwe opened vast areas of pine forest and prairie to American exploitation. The Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and Treaty of Mendota in 1851 were pivotal, forcing the Dakota to cede 24 million acres, nearly all their land in Minnesota, for $1.6 million, most of which was immediately claimed by traders for alleged debts. These treaties confined the Dakota to a narrow reservation along the Minnesota River and the Ojibwe to reservations in the northern forests. The promised payments were often late, incomplete, or stolen by corrupt officials and traders. The Dakota situation became increasingly desperate as their traditional way of life became impossible on the small reservation. Game disappeared and crops failed. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. By 1862, the Dakota people on the Minnesota River Reservation faced starvation. The Civil War had delayed their annual payment. Traders refused to extend credit, and crop failures left them desperate. When 4 young Dakota men killed 5 white settlers near Acton on August 17, 1862, it sparked a wider conflict that had been brewing for years. Under the leadership of Chief Little Crow, Tawyataduta, who reluctantly agreed to lead despite knowing it was hopeless, Dakota warriors attacked settlements and federal outposts along the Minnesota River Valley. The initial attacks were successful, with New Ulm besieged and Fort Ridgely attacked multiple times. Hundreds of settlers were killed, and thousands fled eastern Minnesota in panic. The war lasted just 6 weeks. Federal troops and state militia, led by Colonel Henry Sibley, defeated the Dakota forces at the Battle of Wood Lake on September 23, 1862. The aftermath was brutal. A military commission tried 392 Dakota men, sentencing 303 to death in trials that often lasted just minutes. President Lincoln reviewed the sentences and commuted all but 39, later 38. On December 26, 1862, the 38 Dakota men were hanged in Mankato in the largest mass execution in United States history. Exile and aftermath. The consequences for the Dakota people were catastrophic. The federal government abrogated all treaties, abolished the reservation, and placed a bounty on any Dakota person found in Minnesota. Nearly all Dakota people, including many who had opposed the war or actively helped white settlers, were expelled from Minnesota. About 1,700 Dakota were marched to an internment camp at Fort Snelling, where hundreds died during the winter of 1862-63. The survivors were forced onto reservations in South Dakota and Nebraska. The Ojibwe, though not involved in the war, also faced increased pressure. In 1863, the government attempted to remove all Ojibwe to a new reservation at Leech Lake, leading to years of resistance and negotiation. Many Ojibwe bands managed to retain reservations in their traditional territories, though much reduced in size. The Sandy Lake tragedy of 1850, where hundreds of Ojibwe died due to government incompetence and cruelty during an attempted removal, had already demonstrated the deadly consequences of federal Indian policy. Part 4: Territorial Days and Early Statehood Minnesota. Minnesota Territory, was officially organized on March 3, 1849, carved from the former Iowa and Wisconsin territories. The territory initially had fewer than 5,000 white inhabitants, most clustered around Fort Snelling and the nascent town of St. Paul. Alexander Ramsey, a Pennsylvania politician, became the first territorial governor, arriving in May 1849 to find a frontier region on the cusp of dramatic change. St. Paul, which grew from a collection of whiskey shops expelled from the Fort Snelling military reservation, became the territorial capital. The town's founder, Pierre Pig's Eye Parent, had established a tavern at the landing, but it was Father Lucien Galtier who gave the settlement its more respectable name in 1841. Across the river, St. Anthony, later Minneapolis, was growing around the sawmills at the Falls of St. Anthony. The territory's early politics were dominated by Democrats, fur traders, and land speculators. Henry Sibley, the American Fur Company's regional manager, became the territory's delegate to Congress. The territorial legislature, meeting in a variety of temporary capitals before settling in St. Paul, focused on organizing counties, chartering towns, and promoting immigration and economic development. The push for statehood. By 1857, Minnesota's population had exploded to over 150,000, driven by massive immigration from New England, New York, and increasingly Germany and Scandinavia. The push for statehood became irresistible, though it was complicated by the national slavery debate. Minnesota's application came as the Kansas-Nebraska crisis was tearing the nation apart, and Southern congressmen were reluctant to admit another free state. The Constitutional Convention of 1857 was so bitterly divided between Republicans and Democrats that they met separately, producing two different constitutions that had to be reconciled. The major issues were the state's boundaries, particularly whether to include the agricultural South or the timber-rich North, voting rights for immigrants and people of color, and the location of state institutions. Becoming the 32nd state, Minnesota became the 32nd state on May 11, 1858. Henry Sibley, now a Democrat, defeated Alexander Ramsey to become the first state governor. The new state immediately faced challenges. The Panic of 1857 had devastated the economy, railroad construction had stalled, and conflicts with Native Americans continued to simmer. The state's early years were marked by ambitious railroad schemes, many fraudulent, that promised to connect Minnesota to eastern markets. The most notorious was the $5 million loan of 1858, where the state issued bonds to support railroad construction that largely never materialized, saddling Minnesota with debt that took decades to resolve. Despite these challenges, Minnesota grew rapidly. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered free land to settlers, drawing thousands of immigrant families to the prairies of southern and western Minnesota. Towns sprouted along projected railroad routes, many destined to become ghost towns when the rails went elsewhere, others growing into prosperous communities. Part 5: The Civil War and Recovery. Minnesota in the Civil War. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Minnesota's governor, Alexander Ramsey, happened to be in Washington, D.C. He immediately offered 1,000 Minnesota volunteers to President Lincoln, making Minnesota the first state to pledge troops for the Union cause. The 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment would become one of the most celebrated units of the war. Minnesota ultimately contributed 11 infantry regiments, 2 cavalry regiments, 3 artillery batteries, and 2 sharpshooter companies. About 26,000 men from a state population of just 172,000. This was the highest per capita contribution of any state. Minnesota units fought in nearly every major battle in the Western Theater and several in the East. The 1st Minnesota's charge at Gettysburg on July 2, 1863, became legendary. Ordered to buy time against a Confederate assault, the regiment charged a force 5 times its size, suffering 82% casualties, the highest loss rate of any Union regiment in a single battle. Their sacrifice helped save the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, and possibly the battle itself, the home front. The war transformed Minnesota's economy and society. With so many men at arms, women took on new roles in agriculture and business. The state's wheat production boomed as demand and prices soared, establishing Minnesota as a major grain producer. Minneapolis flour mills, powered by St. Anthony Falls, began their rise to national prominence. The U.S. Dakota War of 1862, occurring during the Civil War, created a second front that required Minnesota to defend itself while supporting the Union cause. The 3rd through 5th Ursinum Minnesota infantry regiments, raised for Civil War service, were retained in Minnesota to fight in the Dakota War, while later regiments had to be raised to meet the state's Civil War obligations. Immigration continued during the war, particularly from Scandinavia and Germany. Many immigrants were recruited directly into the Union Army, with promises of citizenship and land. The 3rd Minnesota Infantry was largely German, the 15th heavily Norwegian, creating ethnic military units that strengthened immigrant communities' American identity. Reconstruction era Minnesota. After the war, Minnesota entered a period of explosive growth. Returning veterans used their bounties and back pay to buy farms or start businesses. The completion of railroad connections to Chicago and Milwaukee in 1867 opened eastern markets to Minnesota products. The state's population doubled between 1860 and 1870, reaching nearly 440,000. This growth wasn't without tensions. The influx of immigrants created ethnic and religious conflicts, particularly between established Yankees and new arrivals from Catholic countries. Labor unrest grew as industrialization accelerated. African Americans, though few in number, faced discrimination despite Minnesota's proud abolitionist heritage. The Granger movement found fertile ground in Minnesota as farmers organized against railroad monopolies and grain elevator operators. Oliver H. Kelly, a Minnesota farmer, founded the National Grange in 1867, which became a powerful force for agricultural reform and cooperative action. Part 6. The Gilded Age Boom. The lumber industry. Following the Civil War, Minnesota's vast pine forests became white gold. The demand for lumber to build the growing cities of the Great Plains was insatiable. Stillwater, on the St. Croix River, proclaimed itself the birthplace of Minnesota, and by the 1870s, it was one of the world's largest lumber centers. The lumber industry operated on a massive scale. In winter, lumberjacks felled giant white and red pines in camps across northern Minnesota. Come spring, the logs were floated down rivers to sawmills. The St. Croix boom site near Stillwater could hold 15 million feet of logs. Minneapolis, despite being inland, became a major lumber center as logs were floated down the Mississippi from the northern pineries. Frederick Weyerhaeuser, who would build one of the world's largest timber empires, got his start in the St. Croix Valley. The industry created Minnesota's first millionaires, but also led to environmental devastation. By 1920, Minnesota's virgin pine forests were essentially gone, leaving behind cut-over lands that would take decades to recover. The flour milling empire, Minneapolis, transformed from a frontier town to the flour milling capital of the world between 1870 and 1900. The key was harnessing the power of St. Anthony Falls and technological innovation. Cadwallader C. Washburn and Charles A. Pillsbury built massive mill complexes that revolutionized flour production. The innovation that made Minneapolis dominant was the new process method developed in the 1870s, using Hungarian-style roller mills instead of traditional millstones. Minneapolis mills could produce fine white flour from the hard spring wheat grown on Minnesota and Dakota prairies. This flour was superior for bread baking and commanded premium prices. By 1885, Minneapolis mills were producing over 7 million barrels of flour annually. The Washburn Crosby Company, later General Mills, and Pillsbury dominated the industry. The mills operated 24 hours a day, employing thousands and creating a network of grain elevators, railroads, and financial institutions. The mill district along the Mississippi became one of the world's greatest industrial complexes, the Iron Range. In 1865, geologist Henry Eames discovered iron ore near Vermilion Lake in northeastern Minnesota. But it wasn't until the 1880s that the true extent of Minnesota's iron wealth was revealed. The Vermilion Range began shipping ore in 1884, but the real treasure was the Mesabi Range, discovered by Leonidas Merritt and his 7 brothers in 1890. The Mesabi Range contained the world's largest deposit of iron ore, and unlike other iron ranges, the ore lay near the surface, making it cheap to extract through open pit mining. Towns like Hibbing, Virginia, and Eveleth sprang up almost overnight. By 1900, the Mesabi Range was producing 9 million tons of ore annually, 30% of the nation's total. The iron industry attracted thousands of immigrants from Finland, Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, and dozens of other countries, creating the ethnically diverse communities that characterize the Iron Range to this day. The ore was shipped through Duluth Superior, which became the world's largest freshwater port. Minnesota iron built America's skyscrapers, railroads, and automobiles, fueling the nation's industrial revolution. James J. Hill and the railroad empire. No individual shaped Minnesota's Gilded Age more than James J. Hill, the empire builder. Born in Canada, Hill came to St. Paul in 1856 and built the Great Northern Railway without government subsidies, the only transcontinental railroad to avoid bankruptcy in the 1893 Depression. Hill's genius lay in developing the territory his railroad served. He promoted scientific farming, imported breeding stock to improve livestock, and even gave away seed grain. He recruited immigrants from Northern Europe, establishing agents in Sweden and Norway to direct settlers to Minnesota and the Dakotas. His railroad made St. Paul a major commercial hub and helped create the economic integration of the Northwest. Hill's influence extended beyond railroads. He was instrumental in developing Minnesota's iron mines, connecting them to Great Lakes shipping. His business philosophy, give low rates, develop the country, and the tonnage will come, helped build the Northwest's economy. Though controversial for his monopolistic practices, Hill's vision of regional development shaped Minnesota's economic geography. Part 7. The Progressive Era. Reform Politics. Minnesota emerged as a leader in the progressive movement of the early 20th century. Governor John Albert Johnson, elected in 1904, championed reforms including railroad regulation, pure food laws, and conservation measures. Though he died in office in 1909, Johnson represented a new style of politics that emphasized expertise and efficiency over patronage. The state pioneered many reforms that would later be adopted nationally. Minnesota established one of the nation's first statewide primary election systems in 1912. The legislature passed workers' compensation laws, regulated child labor, and created a state highway commission. Women gained the right to vote in presidential elections in 1919, a year before the 19th Amendment. Progressive reformers also targeted urban corruption. In Minneapolis, a grand jury exposed a massive system of graft linking the police, politicians, and organized crime in 1902. The revelations led to the adoption of a home rule charter and various good government reforms, though corruption would remain a persistent problem. Labor organizing Minnesota's diversifying economy created a large industrial workforce that increasingly organized for better conditions. The Western Federation of Miners organized iron range workers, leading to major strikes in 1907 and 1916. The 1916 strike shut down the entire Mesabi Range for months and ended only after mining companies made significant concessions. In the Twin Cities, the trades were well organized by 1900. The Minneapolis Trades and Labor Assembly and the St. Paul Trades and Labor Assembly wielded considerable political influence. However, Minneapolis employers, organized in the Citizens Alliance, fought unionization fiercely, earning the city a reputation as the scab capital of America. The industrial workers of the world, IWW or Wobblies, found support among lumber workers, harvest hands, and iron range miners. Their radical vision of industrial unionism and direct action frightened authorities, leading to violent suppression during World War I. The 1916 lynching of Olli Kinkunen, a Finnish-American striker in Duluth, exemplified the era's labor violence. World War I and the Nonpartisan League. World War I divided Minnesota, which had large German and Scandinavian populations with ties to Europe. The Minnesota Commission of Public Safety, created in 1917, had sweeping powers to suppress dissent. It banned German language instruction, harassed suspected socialists, and forced citizens to prove their loyalty through Liberty Bond purchases. The Nonpartisan League, NPL, founded in North Dakota, gained significant support among Minnesota farmers. The NPL advocated state-owned grain elevators, flour mills, and banks, essentially socialism for agriculture. In 1918, the NPL candidate Charles Lindbergh Sr., father of the aviator, nearly won the Republican gubernatorial primary, despite being branded pro-German and seditious. The war's end brought brief but severe economic disruption. The 1920 census revealed that for the first time, more Minnesotans lived in urban areas than rural ones. This shift created new political dynamics that would shape the state for decades to come. Part 8. Between the Wars. The Roaring Twenties. The 1920s brought prosperity and cultural change to Minnesota. The Twin Cities emerged as a major metropolitan area, with Minneapolis reaching 380,000 people and St. Paul 234,000 by 1920. Skyscrapers transformed downtown skylines. The Fauché Tower, completed in Minneapolis in 1929, was the tallest building west of Chicago. Consumer culture flourished. Department stores, like Dayton's and Donaldson's, became retail palaces. Radio station WCCO, The Good Neighbor, began broadcasting in 1924, connecting rural and urban Minnesota. The Minnesota State Fair grew into one of the nation's largest, celebrating agricultural heritage while showcasing modern technology. Prohibition, enacted nationally in 1920 but adopted by Minnesota counties earlier, created a thriving underground economy. St. Paul, under the O'Connor system, became a safe haven for gangsters who agreed not to commit crimes within the city. John Dillinger, Ma Barker, and Alvin Creepy Karpis all spent time in St. Paul. The corruption reached so deep that in 1935, the federal government had to intervene to clean up the city. The Farmer Labor Party. Out of the agricultural distress of the 1920s and the labor struggles of the 1910s emerged America's most successful third party of the 20th century, the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party. Founded in 1918, it united farmers seeking economic justice with urban workers demanding better conditions. The party elected Henrik Shipstead to the U.S. Senate in 1922 and Magnus Johnson in 1923. But its greatest leader was Floyd B. Olson, elected governor in 1930. Olson, a charismatic former prosecutor, articulated a vision of cooperative commonwealth that appealed to Minnesotans suffering from the agricultural depression that preceded the general economic collapse. The Great Depression. The Depression hit Minnesota hard. Farm prices, already depressed through the 1920s, collapsed entirely. In 1932, a bushel of corn sold for 10 cents, less than the cost of production. Mortgage foreclosures threatened thousands of farms. The Farmers Holiday Association organized strikes and penny auctions to prevent foreclosures, sometimes violently confronting authorities. In the cities, unemployment reached 30%. In Minneapolis, the Gateway District became a massive hobo jungle. The Iron Range was devastated as steel demand evaporated. Entire towns virtually shut down. In Duluth, 20% of the population was on relief by 1933. Governor Olson responded with radical measures. He declared a mortgage moratorium, stopping foreclosures. He proposed state ownership of key industries and utilities. When employers refused to negotiate with striking truckers in 1934, Olson declared martial law in Minneapolis. The truckers' strike of 1934 became one of the nation's most significant labor actions, with running battles in the streets and 4 deaths, but ultimately establishing union recognition. The New Deal in Minnesota embraced Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal enthusiastically. The Civilian Conservation Corps established 150 camps in Minnesota, employing 84,000 young men in reforestation and park development. The Works Progress Administration built hundreds of schools, bridges, and public buildings, many still in use today. The distinctive stone buildings and bridges in Minnesota's state parks are WPA legacies. Rural electrification transformed farm life. In 1935, only 4% of Minnesota farms had electricity. By 1950, 90% did. The Rural Electrification Administration, often working through farmer cooperatives, brought power to the countryside, enabling modern farming methods and improving quality of life. Floyd Olson's death from cancer in 1936 marked the end of an era. His successor, Elmer Benson, proved too radical for many Minnesotans and lost in 1938 to Republican Harold Stassen, a young reformer who would dominate state politics for the next decade. Part 9: World War II and the Post-War Boom. Minnesota at War. World War II transformed Minnesota more thoroughly than any event since statehood. The state's industries converted to war production almost overnight. Minneapolis, Honeywell made bomb sites, Munsingware made parachutes, and Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, 3M, produced everything from sandpaper for aircraft factories to reflective materials for road signs. The Twin Cities Ordnance Plant, built in New Ulm and Arden Hills, became one of the world's largest ammunition factories, employing 26,000 workers at its peak. Northern Pump Company, later FMC in Fridley, made gun mounts for naval vessels. The shipyards in Duluth Superior built over 200 vessels for the war effort. Over 300,000 Minnesotans served in the military, about 15% of the state's population. The 34th Red Bull Infantry Division, a National Guard unit, spent more days in combat than any other American division. Minnesota's casualties numbered over 6,000 dead and 14,000 wounded. The war brought unprecedented prosperity. Unemployment vanished, wages soared, and women entered the workforce in massive numbers. The population of the Twin Cities grew by 100,000 as people moved for war jobs. This growth included significant numbers of African Americans from the South and Mexican Americans from Texas, beginning the diversification of Minnesota's overwhelmingly white population. The post-war economic miracle. Minnesota's transition to peacetime proved remarkably smooth. Wartime savings fueled a construction boom. Suburban development exploded, with communities like Bloomington, Richfield, and St. Louis Park transforming from rural townships to bedroom communities almost overnight. The GI Bill enabled thousands of veterans to attend college and buy homes. Minnesota companies that had developed new technologies during the war applied them to consumer products. 3M's Scotch tape became ubiquitous. Honeywell's thermostats appeared in millions of homes. General Mills introduced convenience foods like instant mashed potatoes and cake mixes. These companies began expanding internationally, making Minnesota a player in the global economy. The 1950s saw the rise of Minnesota's medical technology industry. Medtronic, founded in a Minneapolis garage in 1949, developed the first wearable cardiac pacemaker in 1957. The Mayo Clinic in Rochester became world-renowned, attracting patients globally and spurring medical innovation. The University of Minnesota performed the first successful open-heart surgery in 1952. Hubert Humphrey and liberal politics. In 1945, Minneapolis elected Hubert H. Humphrey as mayor. The young professor and pharmacist brought energy and idealism to City Hall, cleaning up police corruption and championing civil rights. In 1948, Humphrey burst onto the national stage at the Democratic National Convention, delivering a passionate speech for civil rights that helped split the Democratic Party, but established him as a liberal leader. Elected to the Senate in 1948, Humphrey became one of the most influential legislators of the 20th century. Though often frustrated in the conservative 1950s, he laid groundwork for later achievements in civil rights, education, and social welfare. His advocacy for the Peace Corps, Food for Peace, and Medicare helped define American liberalism. The 1944 merger of the Farmer Labor Party with the Democrats created the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, DFL, unique among state Democratic parties. This merger, engineered by Humphrey and others, ended third-party politics in Minnesota, but created a reliably liberal political organization that would dominate state politics for decades. Part 10: Social Change and Modernization. The Metropolitan Revolution. The 1960s and 1970s saw the Twin Cities transform into a modern metropolitan area. The Metropolitan Council, created in 1967, became a model for regional governance, coordinating development across 7 counties. This regional approach to transit, sewers, and parks helped the Twin Cities avoid many problems that plagued other American cities. Downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul were dramatically rebuilt. In Minneapolis, the Gateway Urban Renewal Project demolished 200 buildings in the Skid Row district, replacing them with modern offices and apartments. The IDS Tower, completed in 1973, gave Minneapolis an iconic skyline. St. Paul renovated its historic buildings, while adding modern structures like the Town Square complex. The suburbs continued their explosive growth, but in new patterns. Instead of just bedroom communities, suburbs like Edina, Minnetonka, and Bloomington became employment centers. The nation's first enclosed shopping mall, Southdale, opened in Edina in 1956, revolutionizing retail. By 1970, the 7 county metro area housed half of Minnesota's population. Education and cultural growth. Minnesota made massive investments in education during this period. The University of Minnesota grew into one of the nation's largest universities. The state college system expanded with new campuses, and the community college system, established in the 1960s, provided accessible higher education statewide. Cultural institutions flourished. The Guthrie Theater, founded in 1963, brought world-class theater to Minneapolis. The Walker Art Center became a leading contemporary art museum. The Minnesota Orchestra and St. Paul Chamber Orchestra gained international reputations. This cultural flowering helped establish the Twin Cities' reputation for quality of life that attracted educated workers and innovative companies. Iron Range decline and adaptation. While the Twin Cities boomed, the Iron Range faced crisis. Foreign competition and the depletion of high-grade ore devastated the mining industry. Employment in mining fell from 30,000 in 1950 to 6,000 by 1980. Towns like Hibbing and Virginia lost population as young people left for opportunities elsewhere. The state responded with economic diversification efforts. The Taconite Amendment to the state constitution in 1964 guaranteed tax stability for taconite processing, a technology that allowed lower-grade ore to be processed profitably. The Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation Board, funded by mining taxes, invested in tourism and small business development. Though mining would never again employ as many people, taconite production stabilized the regional economy. Environmental Awakening Minnesota emerged as an environmental leader in the 1960s and 1970s. The state created the Pollution Control Agency in 1967 and passed the Environmental Rights Act in 1971. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, protected through decades of struggle, became a symbol of wilderness preservation. The fight over the reserve mining companies' dumping of taconite tailings into Lake Superior became a national environmental cause. The decade-long legal battle, finally resolved in 1980, established important precedents for environmental law and forced the company to build on-land disposal facilities. Governor Wendell Anderson's Minnesota Miracle of 1971 restructured state finances and made Minnesota a model for progressive governance. The state's investment in education, environment, and quality of life earned it national recognition. In 1973, Anderson appeared on Time magazine's cover holding a fish with the caption, "The Good Life in Minnesota." Modern immigration, the 1970s began new waves of immigration that would transform Minnesota. The end of the Vietnam War brought thousands of Southeast Asian refugees, Hmong people who had fought alongside Americans in Laos, settled particularly in St. Paul, which now has one of the largest Hmong populations outside Asia. Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians also established significant communities. Latino immigration, primarily from Mexico, increased dramatically, drawn by agricultural and food processing jobs. Somali refugees began arriving in the 1990s, with Minnesota receiving more Somali refugees than any other state. These new immigrants revitalized aging neighborhoods, started businesses, and added to Minnesota's cultural richness, though not without tensions and challenges of integration. Conclusion: Minnesota. Today and tomorrow. Economic innovation. Today's Minnesota economy builds on historical strengths while embracing new sectors. The medical device industry, anchored by Medtronic, St. Jude Medical, and Boston Scientific, employs thousands. Minnesota companies like Target, Best Buy, and United Health Group are Fortune 500 leaders. The state's cooperative tradition lives on in successful co-ops like Land O'Lakes and CHS. The Twin Cities have become a technology hub with a thriving startup ecosystem. Minnesota's emphasis on education pays dividends with one of the nation's most educated workforces. The state consistently ranks among the best for business, despite relatively high taxes, because of its quality infrastructure and human capital. Agriculture remains important but transformed. Minnesota leads in turkey, sugar beet, and sweet corn production. Organic farming and local food systems grow rapidly. The craft brewing industry, building on the German brewing tradition, has exploded with hundreds of breweries statewide. Contemporary challenges. Minnesota faces significant challenges. The achievement gap between white students and students of color is among the nation's largest. Economic disparities persist, with Native American communities facing poverty rates far above state averages. Rural Minnesota struggles with population decline and economic stagnation as young people leave for urban opportunities. Climate change poses new threats. Warming temperatures affect everything from winter recreation to agricultural patterns. More frequent extreme weather events strain infrastructure. The state has responded with ambitious renewable energy goals, with wind power now providing 20% of Minnesota's electricity. Political polarization has deepened, with growing divides between the Twin Cities metropolitan area and Greater Minnesota. The tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020 sparked global protests and forced a reckoning with racial justice issues that Minnesota, despite its progressive reputation, has struggled to address. The Minnesota identity. Through all these changes, certain aspects of Minnesota character persist. The Minnesota nice culture of polite reserve, mixed with genuine helpfulness, remains recognizable. The state's Scandinavian and German heritage influences everything from food, lutefisk, and lefse remain holiday traditions, to political culture, good government, and social solidarity. Minnesota continues to rank at or near the top in voter turnout, volunteerism, and charitable giving. The state's commitment to education, healthcare, and social welfare, while debated in specifics, remains stronger than most states. Minnesota has more Fortune 500 companies per capita than any state except Connecticut, yet maintains a strong labor movement and cooperative tradition. The state's natural beauty, the forests, lakes, and prairies, remains central to Minnesota identity. The cabin up north, fishing opener, and state fair are cultural touchstones. Environmental protection enjoys broad support across party lines. Looking forward, as Minnesota moves forward, it carries both the burdens and gifts of its history. The state must reckon with the historical injustices against Native peoples and ongoing racial disparities. It must balance urban and rural needs, economic growth and environmental protection, its particular identity, and increasing diversity. Yet, Minnesota's history provides reasons for optimism. This is a state that has repeatedly reinvented itself. From fur trading post to agricultural powerhouse, from lumber and mining to high technology and medical devices. It's a state that has pioneered progressive reforms while maintaining fiscal responsibility, that has welcomed waves of immigrants while preserving distinctive traditions. The Dakota name, Minnesota, sky tinted waters, remains apt. Like its waters reflecting the changing sky, Minnesota reflects and shapes the American experience. From the ancient peoples who first harvested wild rice to today's entrepreneurs developing medical miracles, from the Dakota and Ojibwe nations to the newest Somali and Latino immigrants, all have contributed to the ongoing story of Minnesota. As we conclude this journey through Minnesota's history, we see not just a chronicle of events, but a testament to human adaptability, creativity, and community. The challenges ahead are real, but if history is any guide, Minnesota will meet them with the same combination of pragmatism and idealism, hard work and innovation that has characterized its past. This is Minnesota, a northern state with a warm heart, a place of harsh winters and abundant harvests, of small towns and global corporations, of deep traditions and constant change. Its history is America's history, yet uniquely its own. And that history, still being written every day, continues to shape not just 5.7 million Minnesotans, but the broader American experience. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of the North Star State, Minnesota, the land of sky tinted waters.